It was supposed to be a simple summer evening, grilled burgers, warm laughter, kids running barefoot on the grass. The kind of Saturday that lingers in memory only for its comfort. My sister had strung up fairy lights in her backyard, just like she always did when she hosted one of her famous weekend get-togethers. The scent of citronella candles mixed with smoke from the grill, and for a moment, it all felt perfect. Normal. Familiar. I was standing by the cooler, sipping a watered-down gin and tonic, watching my niece try to teach my husband how to hula hoop. She laughed, he pretended not to care. It should have been harmless. Then the conversation shifted. The music had dipped just low enough for voices to carry. Someone brought up a reality show. One of those trashy late-night ones where couples swap partners and test the strength of their marriages for a shot at notoriety and a cheap vacation. The circle of adults chuckled and shared guilty confessions about watching it. I remember I rolled my eyes and said I couldn't stand that type of television. And then, without warning, my husband chimed in with a voice just loud enough to silence the group. "Well, maybe we should try something like that," he said, gesturing lazily toward me. "Anyone want to swap wives? Mine's a bit too independent anyway." There was a beat. A long, awkward beat where no one knew whether to laugh or say something. The joke landed like a dropped glass. Someone coughed. My sister gave a tight smile. The guy from down the street, I think his name was Aaron, let out a single laugh that died halfway out of his throat. And I froze. I don't know why it hit me so hard. Demeaning jokes weren't exactly new in our marriage. Dismissive comments, subtle jabs wrapped in sarcasm, I had learned to live with those. But this was different. This was public. This was humiliation, not humor. I caught the flash of something ugly in Derek's eyes when he looked at me, waiting to see how I'd react. I didn't say a word. I just set my drink down on the patio table and walked back inside the house. My legs felt stiff like I was learning to walk again. I wasn't even angry at first. Just stunned. Hurt. Embarrassed. I locked myself in the bathroom and stared at myself in the mirror. My reflection looked like a stranger. One who still wore a polite smile. A woman who was supposed to laugh off her husband's cruelty because that's what good wives do, right? Because you don't ruin a party over a joke. Because speaking up makes you the problem. 10 minutes passed before someone knocked on the door. It was my sister. "You okay?" she asked gently. I told her I had a headache. She nodded, though her eyes told me she didn't believe me. But she didn't press. I splashed cold water on my face, reapplied my lipstick and went back outside like nothing happened. Like I hadn't just been reduced to a punchline in front of a dozen people I barely knew. The rest of the evening blurred together. I went through the motions. Smiling, chatting, holding Derek's hand when he reached for mine, though my skin crawled when he touched me. We drove home in silence. He didn't apologize. Didn't even bring it up. As if the whole thing hadn't happened. I lay awake that night next to him, listening to his breathing even out as he drifted off. My mind wouldn't stop spinning. The words kept playing over and over again. Too independent. As if that were a flaw. As if my ability to think for myself made me unworthy of love. As if he had ever actually loved me to begin with. I thought back to all the little moments that led us here. The time he rolled his eyes when I said I wanted to apply for a promotion. The way he introduced me as his wife instead of by name. The times he called me difficult when I disagreed with him in front of friends. It wasn't just a joke. It was a truth he'd been holding on to for years, and that night he finally said it out loud. But the part that changed everything wasn't Derek's joke. It was the reaction. Or rather, the lack of one. No one defended me. No one stood up. Except one man. I didn't even know his name at the time. I remembered seeing him at a few other neighborhood things. Tall, quiet, always polite but never the loudest in the room. That night, when the laughter faded, he looked directly at Derek and said, "That's not funny, man." Just 4 words. But they landed like a thunderclap. Derek had chuckled, waved it off with a relax, "It's a joke." But the moment had passed. The crowd shifted. Conversations broke off. Some people excused themselves early. The lightness in the air had vanished. And I remembered feeling for the first time in years like someone actually saw me. Not as a burden or a punchline, but as a person worth defending. That feeling haunted me. In the days that followed, I kept going back to that moment. Not out of romantic curiosity or fantasy, just a deep, echoing need to understand why it had mattered so much. Why 4 words from a stranger had left more of a mark on me than the years I had spent trying to please a man who couldn't bear my independence. Maybe because those 4 words told me the truth I'd been avoiding. It wasn't normal. It wasn't okay. I wasn't being too sensitive. I wasn't imagining it. I had been shrinking for years, cutting myself down to fit into someone else's version of a wife. And now I couldn't unhear it. I couldn't unsee myself in that moment. Small, humiliated, and desperately pretending it didn't hurt. But it did. More than I realized. And something in me had started to shift. Quietly. Irrevocably. It happened faster than I could process. One moment I was still absorbing the sting of Derek's words, still tasting the bitterness of being laughed at like a bad joke in front of friends and strangers alike, and the next, there it was. A voice, deep and clear, slicing through the awkward silence like a knife through paper. "I'll gladly take her," he said. Just like that. No hesitation. No grin. No wink. The words weren't offered like a punchline or a flirtation. They were spoken plainly, seriously, with a kind of weight that made everyone around us stiffen. The backyard, moments before so full of idle conversation and clinking glasses, suddenly felt suspended in time. Even the music seemed to fade out mid-note. All heads turned toward him. Max. I hadn't even known his name until that instant. He lived 2 doors down, I think. A quiet man, a little older than me, always well-dressed in that effortless way that suggests someone with taste but no ego about it. I had seen him walking his dog in the mornings, always nodding politely, eyes calm and steady but never lingering. Till now. He didn't look at anyone else. Not Derek. Not the others. He looked straight at me. Not with lust or bravado. There was no challenge in his stare, no smirk pulling at the corner of his mouth. Just certainty. As if he had been waiting for this moment, or perhaps recognizing it at the same time I did. Derek, seated beside me in his usual performative sprawl, let out a short, scoffing laugh, the kind that men like him use to reassert dominance when they feel it slipping. "Yeah, okay, buddy," he muttered, waving a hand like he was shooing away a mosquito. But I didn't look at him. I couldn't. My eyes stayed locked with Max's. Something in my chest had shifted the moment he spoke. It was as if a long-forgotten part of me, something buried beneath years of compromise, of biting my tongue, of trying to be smaller and quieter, had suddenly started to breathe again. I felt warm and cold at the same time. I felt seen. Not in the way Derek always said seen, when he was referring to the way I looked at parties or how I spoke in meetings. This wasn't about appearance or performance. This was about being recognized as a full person. A woman with thoughts, with worth, with something valuable beyond how well she smiled through her husband's condescension. I could hear the whispering now, soft murmurs around us as the group tried to make sense of what had just happened. Some looked away, pretending to have not heard anything. Others stared at us with open curiosity, like they were watching a scene in a play, unsure whether it was comedy or tragedy. But I didn't care. For the first time in what felt like years, I truly didn't care about appearances or consequences or who might be watching. I looked at Derek. I really looked at him. And what I saw in his face wasn't amusement or control. It was confusion. Maybe even fear. He didn't understand what was happening. He didn't know why I hadn't already started smoothing the situation over like I always did, hadn't already forced a smile or made some self-deprecating joke to make everyone else comfortable again. I had always been good at that. At shrinking the moment. At making his behavior seem less than what it was. But not this time. My voice was even, quiet but unshakably clear when I spoke. 7 o'clock, I said. That was it. I didn't explain what I meant. I didn't need to. I watched Derek's face shift. First confusion, then disbelief, and finally something bordering on panic. The color drained slightly from his cheeks. His jaw flexed, but he said nothing. Max didn't flinch. He just gave the smallest of nods, almost imperceptible, as if to say he understood. Maybe he did. Maybe he understood more than anyone else there, more than even I did in that moment. The rest of the evening was a blur. Conversations resumed eventually, but with less enthusiasm, less ease. People avoided looking at us directly. The atmosphere had been cracked, the illusion of perfect suburban civility shattered by one man's cruelty and another's refusal to ignore it. And by my own unexpected response. I didn't speak to Derek the rest of the night. We went home in silence again, but this time the silence wasn't just heavy, it was different. His presence beside me felt like a stranger's. I could feel him glancing at me in the car, waiting for me to say something, to offer him a lifeline. I said nothing. My mind was loud, though. It was racing. Not with fantasies, not with regrets, but with the realization that something irreversible had just happened. A thread had snapped. A line had been drawn. And I had finally stepped over it. I didn't look back. The moment my feet stepped off the patio and onto the grass, something inside me cracked open like a fault line splitting under pressure. The laughter behind me had thinned into whispers, the kind of quiet that always follows something irreversible. I could feel all their eyes on my back, some wide with confusion, others narrowed in judgment, and a few watching with a kind of stunned awe, but I kept walking. My heels sank slightly into the soft lawn, my legs shaking just enough to make each step feel like I might stumble, but I didn't stop. I didn't rush either. I walked with my head high, my spine pulled straight as if I were balancing the weight of my entire life on top of it. Derek's voice came next, loud and sudden, filled with the kind of disbelief that only surfaces when control begins to slip away. "Suzanne, what the hell are you doing?" he shouted after me. Then again louder. "Suzanne, get back here." I heard the scrape of his chair, the nervous shifting of the other guests. His voice was trying to sound firm, commanding, but I heard the edges of desperation crack through. The tone he used when something wasn't going his way and he didn't know how to fix it. But he didn't follow me. Maybe he thought I was bluffing. Maybe he assumed I'd stop at the gate and turn around, that I'd laugh it off and come back, apologizing for making a scene. That's what I always did after all. Smooth the moment. Shrink myself back into place. But not this time. My fingers were trembling at my sides. My breath came in sharp bursts like I had just surfaced from deep underwater and my lungs were relearning how to fill with air. Each inhale scraped against my ribs. My throat was tight. I didn't even know where I was going. I hadn't planned this. There was no bag, no phone in my hand, no dramatic exit line. Just movement. Just the absolute need to step away from that house, from that yard, from the man whose voice had turned my name into a threat. The night air hit my skin like a shock, cool and damp, carrying with it the distant scent of summer earth and warm asphalt. It wrapped around my bare arms and sent a ripple of goosebumps across my skin, but I welcomed the chill. Grounded me. Reminded me that I was here. That this was real. My heart was hammering in my chest, each beat louder than the last, echoing in my ears like the thump of distant drums. I reached the gate, white painted wood slightly crooked on one hinge, and for a moment my hand hovered over the latch. My fingers hesitated just slightly and that was when I realized my hands were shaking. Not with fear exactly and not with anger either but with something far deeper. A kind of trembling that comes when a part of you knows that everything is about to change, and the rest of you is trying to catch up to that knowing. I pulled the latch. The gate creaked open with a sound that felt louder than it should have been. I stepped through and with that one movement so small so quiet, I felt something peel away from my shoulders. The weight of it almost made me stumble. Years of words swallowed, feelings ignored, apologies whispered for things I didn't do. All of it fell behind me like I was shedding a second skin. My chest still burned tight and electric but now the air was starting to reach the bottom of my lungs. I was breathing again. Not perfectly. Not fully. But better than I had in a very long time. Behind me I heard someone say my name softly, almost uncertainly, but I didn't stop to see who it was. The driveway stretched ahead, empty and silent except for the buzz of street lamps and the quiet hum of insects. I could hear the party still happening behind me, muffled now as if it were happening on the other side of a thick wall. I didn't belong there anymore. Maybe I never did. I walked. My hands were cold despite the warmth of the summer night, and my feet ached slightly from the heels I hadn't planned to wear this long. My heart hadn't slowed yet. It kept pounding with every step I took, not just in fear but in something else. Something jagged and raw but deeply, unmistakably mine. I could feel my muscles tightening and loosening, my body unsure whether to collapse or run. I did neither. I just kept walking. I didn't know what would happen next. I didn't know where I was going to sleep or who I would talk to or what I would say. I had no answers. No plan. Only the deep, unshakable certainty that I couldn't stay in that yard, in that house, in that life, pretending not to hear the cracks in my own foundation. Every step away was a decision, an act of rebellion so small it might have looked invisible to someone else, but to me it was seismic. I chose myself. Not because I wanted drama, not because I was angry or reckless or proud, but because I couldn't pretend any longer that staying was easier than leaving. It wasn't. Not anymore. By the time I reached the end of the block, the air felt different. Lighter. Not safe, not certain, but possible. And that was enough. It wasn't always like this. And that's the part that still stings, still pulls at the edges of my memory when I least expect it. Before the coldness, before the jokes that turned sharp and cruel, before the silence that grew between us like ivy curling over stone, there was a version of us I used to believe in. A version I used to protect. I met Derek 8 years ago at Pacific Core Systems. I was new, full of fire, determined to make my mark. Fresh out of a toxic junior role where my ideas were ignored and my presence treated like decoration, I had walked into that office on the first day with my shoulders square and my voice steady. I was hired as a digital strategist, a title that barely encompassed what I actually did. The role was chaotic, undefined, but I was good at finding order in chaos. I liked building things from scratch, carving paths where no one else had looked. And back then he noticed that. Derek was already established. Confident. The kind of man who could walk into any room and immediately make people listen. He was a lead project manager with a polished reputation and a long list of high-profile clients under his belt. Everyone knew him. Everyone liked him. And he liked me, at least at first. I still remember the first time we spoke. It was in the break room of all places. I was juggling 2 client calls, trying to eat a protein bar with one hand and scribble notes with the other. He walked in, saw me and laughed, not unkindly. "Are you always like this?" he asked, grinning. I glanced up, caught off guard, and said, "Only when I'm trying to change the world before lunch." He liked that. He told me later that's when he knew I was different. First he admired me. That was the word he used. Admired. He told me I was the smartest woman he'd met in the company. That I was magnetic. That watching me speak in meetings gave him goosebumps. I remember how he'd sit in the back of the room and just watch me lead a strategy session, eyes focused, mouth curled into a half smile that made me feel like I was the only one in the world. When I landed my first big campaign win, he brought champagne to my desk and toasted to my future. "You're going to run this place someday," he said. And I believed him. In the beginning it felt like we were equals. Like two strong forces orbiting each other, pushing each other forward. We stayed late in the office together talking about ideas, dreams, the future. He said I made him want to be better. That I inspired him. I let myself fall into the warmth of that praise, thinking I had found someone who truly saw me, not just my charm or my ambition, but the machinery inside me that never stopped moving. But over time something changed. Gradually, then all at once. I noticed it in the way his compliments shifted. They grew quieter, more reserved, as if my success had begun to cast shadows he didn't want to stand in. He stopped asking about my projects. Stopped celebrating the wins. When I got promoted to lead strategist, he didn't say congratulations. He made a joke at dinner that night. "Well, now you're officially smarter than me. Should I start calling you boss?" He laughed, but the edge in his voice was impossible to miss. At first I brushed it off. Told myself it was just stress, adjustment, normal relationship stuff. But the pattern kept repeating. Each time I took initiative, he found a way to dim it. When I suggested we move to a new neighborhood to be closer to a startup hub I was working with, he scoffed. "What, so you can pretend to be one of those tech founders?" he said with a smirk. When I published an op-ed in an industry magazine, he asked if I'd written it myself. That one gutted me. Then came the jokes. Always in front of others. "Don't get her started," he'd say when I tried to weigh in on something. "You know how she gets when she thinks she's right." Or, "You can't win with Suzanne, she's got a business plan for everything, even breakfast." He delivered them with a smile, always chuckling as if I should be flattered by the attention. As if reducing me to a punchline was a kind of affection. But it didn't feel like affection. It felt like erasure. And every time I called him out, he turned it back on me. Said I was too sensitive. That I couldn't take a joke. That I was making everything about me. So I started saying less. Holding back in conversations. Editing myself in meetings, at parties, even at home. I learned the exact tone that wouldn't make him feel threatened. I became quieter, gentler, more agreeable. Not because it was who I was, but because it was who I had to be to keep the peace. Eventually, I stopped recognizing myself in the mirror. What once felt like admiration turned into quiet resentment. The more I succeeded, the colder he became. His touch faded. His words grew clipped. He'd come home and barely look at me. If I brought up an idea, he'd nod vaguely and return to his phone. If I asked for his thoughts, he'd shrug. "You've got it all figured out anyway, right?" he said once, not bothering to lift his eyes from the screen. There were good days, of course. That's how it works. Enough warmth to confuse the cold. Enough affection to make you question your instincts. He still knew how to make me laugh when he tried. Still told me I looked beautiful when we dressed up for events. But the weight of all the small dismissals started to crush those moments. And even on the good days, I felt like I was performing someone else's life. Like I was smiling through a glass wall, watching myself from the other side. What had started as a relationship built on mutual respect had turned into a cage. And I didn't see the bars at first because they weren't made of violence or shouting or broken promises. They were made of silence. Of undermining. Of slowly chipping away at everything I once took pride in, until I wasn't sure if I was brilliant anymore or just difficult. I used to believe Derek loved me because of my fire. But now I know he only loved me as long as he could control it. And the moment he couldn't, the moment it began to shine brighter than his own, he tried to smother it. I had mistaken the cage for safety. And now, for the first time in years, I was finally walking out of it. The day I got promoted to head of strategy should have been one of the most affirming, celebratory moments of my life. I had worked for it relentlessly, staying late for months, managing projects beyond my pay grade, mentoring juniors without recognition, and pulling a crumbling team into something functional and respected. I was exhausted, but I was proud. I still remember how my hands trembled as I opened the email with the official offer. My name, bolded, followed by the title I had dreamed about for years. I felt this wave of validation rush through me, like everything I had fought for had finally been acknowledged. I called Derek the moment I stepped out of the meeting. I couldn't wait to tell him. I expected excitement in his voice, or at the very least, curiosity. I wanted to share that win with him, to feel like it mattered to both of us. But when I told him, there was a pause on the other end of the line. Just long enough to make my heart sink. He laughed. Not the kind of laugh that says, "I'm happy for you." It was low and short, the kind of laugh that carries a bitter undertone. "Well," he said, "looks like someone impressed the right people." I froze. "What's that supposed to mean?" I asked, already knowing but needing him to say it. He brushed it off, of course. "Relax. I'm joking. Don't get all serious on me." But the joke was sharp. It landed somewhere deep inside me, somewhere tender. He didn't ask what the role included. He didn't ask about my raise or the team I'd be leading or how I felt. He just said, "I guess this means you'll be spending even more time at the office." That was the first time I felt it that clearly, his discomfort with my ambition. But it wasn't the last. A few months later, I got an unexpected message from a recruiter representing one of our top competitors. They had seen my recent keynote presentation at an industry summit and were impressed. They invited me to interview for a director-level position. More responsibility, greater impact, and a salary that reflected both. I was shocked at first, and then thrilled. It felt like another door opening, a sign that I wasn't just doing well, I was being noticed. When I told Derek about it, I expected at least a flicker of pride. He barely looked up from his laptop. "That's fast," he said. I nodded, explaining how they'd found me, how they were interested in bringing someone in to reimagine their digital division. I told him it was exploratory, nothing guaranteed. I wanted to see what was out there. He closed his laptop slowly and then looked at me in a way I hadn't seen before, not with anger but something colder. "Why would you even consider leaving?" he asked. "We've both just gotten into a good rhythm. Why shake things up?" I told him it wasn't about leaving him or leaving our life. It was about growth. Challenge. A chance to lead on a different scale. But he wasn't listening. Then he said it. "I don't want my wife making more money than me." The words came out flat. No attempt to dress them up, no nervous laugh to mask them. He just said it. Like it was obvious. Like it was a fact of marriage I should have understood from the beginning. I stared at him. Waiting. For a correction. A smile. Something. But he didn't blink. He meant it. I remember standing in the kitchen, still holding my phone, the recruiter's message glowing on the screen. And I just stood there watching a version of my future vanish in real time. Not because I lacked the ability or the qualifications or the hunger, but because the man I shared my life with couldn't handle it. He didn't ask me to decline the interview. He didn't need to. I could already see the tension forming between us, the fights waiting to unfold, the emotional fallout he would weaponize if I went through with it. He had always been good at wearing me down softly, never telling me what to do, but making the cost of disobedience so high that I'd quietly comply. I didn't answer the recruiter. I let the invitation expire. And I told myself it was fine. That I wasn't ready. That the timing was wrong. That loyalty mattered more. But the truth was uglier. I turned it down because he couldn't stomach my success. Because he needed me small enough to manage, just ambitious enough to admire from a distance, but never threatening enough to disrupt the image he had of himself. The image of being the more powerful one. The provider. The man in the room. After that, something inside me started to shift. Not loudly. Not all at once. But steadily. I stopped bringing work home to share with him. I stopped telling him about my ideas, about the people who sought my advice, about the women who emailed me thanking me for being visible in a male-dominated space. I stopped letting him into that part of me, the part that still burned, still dreamed. And in that silence, resentment bloomed like a bruise. The promotion I had once celebrated began to feel like a secret I had to carry alone. My wins became whispers. My confidence, something I protected like a flickering flame. I had built a life full of momentum, but the person beside me was dragging an invisible anchor behind every step I took forward. And that's when I started to understand. My success wasn't the problem. His ego was. It didn't happen in one night. It was a slow descent, so subtle and expertly paced that I didn't realize how far I had fallen until I could no longer see the surface. Derek had a gift, a calculated charm that masked everything cruel behind a laugh, and in public he wore that charm like a well-tailored suit. He was always the funny one at dinners, the clever one at parties, the man who could tell a joke and make everyone lean in even when the joke was at my expense. Especially when it was. He told them I was scary smart, but with a look that turned it into a warning. He joked that I ran our house like a Fortune 500 company, that I scheduled intimacy like it was a board meeting, that I never stopped talking about marketing KPIs even in bed. People laughed. I laughed too at first. That nervous, trained kind of laugh. The one you give to keep the air from turning heavy, to avoid being called too sensitive or too serious. It was easier than explaining how it really felt. Because behind the laughter there was always a sting. And he knew it. He knew how to craft the exact sentence that would earn him admiration and leave me shrinking. He never called me names, never raised his voice. He didn't have to. He wielded sarcasm like a scalpel, precise, bloodless, deadly. At home, the jokes turned into silence. He stopped engaging with me in ways that felt real. Our conversations became transactional, functional. If I tried to talk about my work, he would nod distractedly, scroll through his phone, maybe interrupt with something trivial like, "Did you remember to pay the gas bill?" If I stayed late at the office, he'd greet me with a passive-aggressive comment, "Wow, you decided to come home," or, "Saving the world again, are we?" There was no warmth in it. No curiosity. Just the cold echo of someone who had stopped seeing me as a partner and now saw me as a problem to manage. Everything I did became a challenge to his authority. If I succeeded, it was an accusation. If I spoke with conviction, I was lecturing. If I disagreed with him, I was overreacting. He never had to outright forbid me from doing anything, he just made the idea of trying feel exhausting. He could change the temperature of a room with a glance. I began to measure my words, weigh my tone, avoid confrontation at all costs. I stopped sharing my ideas. I stopped correcting him when he was wrong. I stopped dreaming out loud. Because every time I reached for something, he found a way to slap my hand without touching it. I began to disappear in increments. There were days when I barely spoke at all. I'd get home from work and go straight to the shower just to be alone. I'd stand there under the hot water, replaying conversations in my head, wondering how I had ended up here. I didn't cry. I was too tired for that. The kind of tired that sinks into your bones, that eats at your ability to feel anything clearly. I was angry, yes, but it was buried beneath layers of numbness. Rage wrapped in resignation. And still I smiled. In front of friends, I smiled. At work events, I smiled. I learned to play the role of the woman with the perfect life. Successful, married, elegant, composed. I smiled at dinner parties while Derek told stories that erased me. I smiled through meetings when my phone buzzed with one of his passive texts. I smiled when people told me how lucky I was to have such a confident, funny husband. And the longer I performed that role, the more invisible I felt. My life became a theater, a polished script I recited while my real self shrank further behind the curtain. But the truth was never as neat as the performance. The truth was sharp and ugly and relentless. The truth was that I was trapped in a house with a man who treated me like a competitor he was trying to outplay. A man who saw my achievements as threats and my confidence as arrogance. Who made me feel like I had to apologize for every part of me that wasn't soft, quiet, or easy to control. And inside me something was building. It wasn't just sadness. It was fury. Quiet, simmering fury that pulsed beneath my skin every time he interrupted me, every time he dismissed a win, every time he laughed while I swallowed the ache in my throat. I carried it in my chest like a live wire, twisting tighter with each insult disguised as humor, with each cold shoulder, with each moment of manipulation so expertly delivered that I began to question my own memory of it. He had taken the woman he once said he admired and tried to reshape her into someone less threatening, someone smaller, someone more manageable. And for a long time I let him. I told myself that's what love was: compromise, patience, understanding. But it wasn't compromise. It was erosion. It was watching myself vanish, piece by piece, while keeping a smile on my face so no one would notice. But I noticed. Even in the silence. Even in the exhaustion. Even when I said nothing, a voice deep inside me kept whispering, "This is not love. This is not safety. This is not what you were meant for." And no matter how many times I buried that voice, it never left. The house was dark when I returned. I had walked for nearly an hour after leaving the backyard, circling blocks I knew by heart but never truly saw until that night. Every streetlight felt like a checkpoint in some internal journey I didn't yet understand, each footstep grounding me more than the last. By the time I stepped through our front door, I wasn't calm, but I was steady. There was something solid beneath my skin, something that hadn't been there in years. A silence that didn't feel like surrender but like clarity. I didn't expect him to be home yet, but he was. I found his shoes by the hallway bench, one tipped onto its side like he had kicked it off in a rush. The living room lights were still on, half the throw pillows on the floor and a glass tipped over on the coffee table. The smell of beer lingered in the air, bitter and stale, mixed with something acidic, anger. He must have come back right after I left, maybe trying to catch me, maybe trying to figure out how to undo what I had already decided not to hide. I didn't speak as I walked past the living room toward the bedroom. I didn't call his name. I just moved with quiet purpose, my fingers unclasping my necklace, my hands sliding off the bracelet he bought me 2 birthdays ago, the one I always wore out of habit more than affection. The silence of the house was thick, like it knew what was coming before I did. I had just stepped out of the closet when I heard him. He was coming down the hall, his footsteps uneven, heavy. He was drunk. Not wasted, not stumbling, but just drunk enough for the volume of his voice to rise and for his emotions to spill out in messy, careless ways. His breath carried that sour edge of liquor, and his eyes, usually cool and calculating, were lit with confusion and offense. "So that's it," he snapped from the doorway. "You just walk out of a party like that? Humiliate me in front of our friends." I didn't answer. I didn't owe him one. "I'm talking to you, Suzanne," he said louder, stepping into the room. "You think that was funny? You think making some joke about 7 o'clock in front of everyone makes you clever? You made a fool out of me." I looked at him and saw what I had been too tired to see clearly for years. Not a man in pain. Not a husband trying to fix something. But a boy throwing a tantrum because something had happened that he couldn't control. Something he didn't expect. Me. "I'm going to bed," I said, my voice quiet but not fragile. He stared at me, stunned, like I had slapped him. "What?" he barked. "I'm going to bed," I repeated calmly. "You can stay up and yell if you want. I'm done." His face twisted, his confusion folding quickly into rage. "You don't just walk away from this. You don't get to act like that in front of people and pretend nothing happened." I didn't move. "You embarrassed me," he went on, now pacing. "You need to call them. I'll call Max and tell him it was a joke. Tell him you didn't mean it. You're not seeing anyone. You're not doing anything. You're not going anywhere at 7 or any other time." He was breathless now, his chest rising with fury, his words clashing into each other. But I stayed still. I didn't flinch. For the first time in years, I didn't try to calm him. I didn't apologize. I didn't soften the air between us with some measured compromise to help him feel strong again. I let him sit in it. The silence, the rejection, the simple truth that I was no longer playing along. He was expecting a fight. A back and forth. A breakdown, maybe. What he got instead was stillness. "No," I said finally. Just one word. No flourish. No elaboration. He looked like he didn't know what to do with that word. Like it didn't compute. "I'm not apologizing," I added. "I'm not explaining myself. And I'm definitely not canceling anything." The color drained from his face in a strange way. Anger fighting panic, disbelief fighting something softer and darker, something like fear. He tried again, his voice lower this time. "You're overreacting. You always do this. You twist things." "No," I repeated. "That's not going to work tonight." And it wasn't just that night. It was the years before it. The accumulation of small cuts and heavy silences, of my achievements turned into liabilities, of my joy becoming a threat to his comfort. The balance had always been tipped in his favor, but only because I had held my side down for so long, trying to keep the peace, trying to keep love from unraveling. But now I saw it clearly. The peace had never been real. It had only been silence. My silence. And the second I broke it, the whole illusion cracked with it. He stood there a few seconds longer, as if waiting for me to come to my senses. As if the old Suzanne, the agreeable one, the careful one, would suddenly blink awake and apologize for her little rebellion. But she was gone. Or maybe she had just stepped aside, finally making room for the woman I had tried to suppress for so long, the one who chose herself without explanation. I turned away from him, walked past his clenched jaw and burning stare, and got into bed. I didn't slam the door. I didn't cry into the pillow. I didn't rehearse the argument in my head or wonder what he was doing in the next room. I lay down slowly, my back to the door, my breath shaking but steady. It wasn't peace, not yet. But it was the first moment of real quiet I had felt in years. And that night, wrapped in stillness, I finally said no. Not to a request. Not to an evening plan. But to a life I no longer recognized as mine. The dress had been hanging in the back of my closet for years, tucked between garments I no longer wore and versions of myself I had stopped recognizing. Soft blue, just between sky and porcelain, with thin straps that traced my shoulders and a skirt that moved like it had its own rhythm. I had bought it for an anniversary dinner 5 years ago, back when I still thought dressing up would bring us closer again. I never wore it that night. Derek said it was too much for the place we were going. So I had taken it off, folded it carefully, and pushed it deep into the dark like so many other things I had quietly set aside. But that evening I slipped it on without hesitation. My fingers zipped it up slowly, and for a moment I stood in front of the mirror just staring at myself. Not to judge, not to adjust, just to see. The way the fabric hugged my waist, the way the color brought out the lighter flecks in my eyes. I looked like myself, not the version I had learned to shrink into, but someone fuller, clearer. Not better, just more honest. The restaurant was tucked on the corner of a quiet street, warm light glowing from behind tall windows, the kind that made the night feel less like an event and more like an invitation. Dolce and Basil. I had passed it many times before but never been inside. Derek preferred louder places, flashier menus, somewhere he could order a drink in a loud voice and get attention from the bartender. This place was quieter. There was music, but it was soft, like a breeze slipping between candles on linen-covered tables. The scent of herbs lingered in the air, Warm basil, roasted garlic, and something faintly citrus. Felt like exhaling. Max was already there when I arrived. He stood as I approached, his expression unreadable at first, then softening into a smile that wasn't too wide or too eager, just warm. There was no smugness, no air of conquest or flirtation. He looked at me like a person you recognize even though you've never truly met them before. His eyes settled on me, not in the way of someone taking inventory, but as someone quietly acknowledging that I had shown up, not just to the restaurant but to something larger. "You look," he began, then paused, not out of hesitation, but because he seemed to be searching for the right word. "You look like yourself." No one had said that to me before. Not in years. We sat and there was no pressure to perform. No script I had to follow. No invisible test I had to pass. The conversation unfolded slowly, like leaves opening under the morning sun. He didn't pepper me with questions or offer unsolicited advice. He didn't interrupt. He didn't try to make me laugh to prove his charm. He simply listened. When I spoke, he leaned in, not with his body but with his attention. Like every word mattered because I was the one saying it. I told him things I didn't expect to say. I told him about work, about the promotion I had almost celebrated, about the job I didn't take. I told him about the barbecues and the silence and the tiredness that had nothing to do with sleep. I told him about the jokes that weren't funny and the long, quiet ache of being unseen by someone who claimed to love me. He didn't offer platitudes. He didn't rush to rescue or fix or pity. He just looked at me with this rare kind of steadiness, as if none of what I had shared made me smaller in his eyes. If anything, it made me feel more human. More complete. There were moments when we fell into silence, not the awkward kind but the kind that feels like a deep breath between sentences. Our glasses caught the candlelight and cast soft rings onto the tablecloth. The waiter came and went without interrupting anything real. I picked at my pasta slowly, tasted the red wine without analyzing its notes. For once, I wasn't performing womanhood. I wasn't managing a moment. I wasn't curating my personality to make someone else comfortable. I was just there. And that was enough. Max told me about his work. About the design project he was leading, a library space being built in an underserved neighborhood, and I listened not just to his words but to the way he cared. About detail. About dignity. About things that mattered in quiet, steady ways. He spoke gently but with clarity, never once trying to sound bigger than he was. And when he looked at me, there was no hint of possession in his eyes. Only recognition. By the time dessert came, something with honey and lavender which we shared without formality, I realized my shoulders had relaxed. My jaw, which I hadn't noticed had been clenched for years, had softened. I wasn't waiting for a blow. I wasn't anticipating the next criticism disguised as concern. I was just sitting in a moment of peace. And it felt revolutionary. I walked home alone that night, my heels clicking lightly against the sidewalk, the air cool against my skin, and the street lamp shadows long and golden. I didn't check my phone. I didn't rehearse explanations or apologies. I didn't feel guilty. For once, I felt like a woman who had simply had dinner. Not an act of rebellion. Not a scandal. Just a dinner. But beneath that simple truth was something deeper. An ember of something I had almost forgotten how to name. Freedom. I didn't know where it would lead or what would come next. But as I walked, the dress swaying gently around my legs, I felt no fear. I felt myself. Not too much. Not too little. Just exactly as I was. And for the first time in years, that was enough. I saw him the moment he came through the doors. Not because he made an entrance, though he did, but because something in the room shifted the second he appeared. The low hum of quiet conversations, the clink of glassware, the soft brush of silver on porcelain, all of it fell under the weight of his fury before a single word was spoken. Derek's face was red, his jaw tight, and he was already moving fast, scanning the tables with a wildness I hadn't seen before. For a man who prided himself on control, he looked completely undone. When his eyes locked on me, I felt my breath catch. Not out of fear but in anticipation. I knew this moment would come. I just didn't know when or how loud it would be. "Are you serious, Suzanne?" he shouted across the dining room, his voice slicing through the quiet with no hesitation. Heads turned instantly. A fork clattered to a plate at the next table. I didn't move. I sat still, hands in my lap, back straight. Max turned to look at him too, but calmly, no reaction on his face, just awareness. No panic. No surprise. Derek was already at our table before anyone could stop him. "This is what we're doing now?" he snarled, waving his hand between me and Max. "You walk out of a party like some dramatic teenager and now you're playing house with the neighbor?" I didn't answer. I just looked at him, really looked. His rage wasn't just visible. It was naked. Desperate. All the polished sarcasm and passive contempt had cracked away, and what was left was something raw and pathetic. And loud. He leaned in closer, lowering his voice slightly, but not enough to hide it from those around us. You're coming with me. No. We're not doing this circus. I glanced at Max for a second. Not for protection. Not for permission. Just acknowledgement. And then I turned back to Derek and for the first time I said what I had carried inside me for far too long. No, I said clearly. Not cruelly. Just finally. He blinked like he hadn't heard me right. I'm not going with you, I continued steady. I'm not yours. Not anymore. I'm not your property. I never was. The words came out with no tremble. No stumble. I wasn't shaking. I wasn't shrinking. I was still sitting in that same soft blue dress, my napkin folded neatly across my knees, the candlelight catching on the edge of my wineglass. And yet everything had changed. He didn't know what to do with that. He tried to laugh but it was hollow, a sound too late and too forced. You're serious? He asked louder again. This is who you are now? People were watching. Every table near us had gone completely silent. No more clinking. No more whispers. Just stillness. And suddenly I didn't care. The fear I used to carry, the embarrassment, the instinct to minimize, to explain, to protect him from himself, was gone. Max stood slowly, not aggressively, not threatening. Just placing himself gently between us. A line had been drawn and he stepped onto it with quiet conviction. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. That was when Derek lost the rest of his composure. Get out of my way, he hissed at Max. This is between me and my wife. I'm not your wife, I said, still seated. Not the way you think. By now, a server had stepped aside to get the manager, and within moments 2 members of the restaurant staff appeared. Not rushed. Not dramatic. Just quiet and firm, the way people trained for moments like this are. Sir, one of them said, placing a hand gently near Derek's elbow, you need to leave. Derek tried to shake him off. Don't touch me. She's my... He started but then stopped mid-sentence, realizing maybe for the first time just how visible he was. The mask had slipped completely now and no one in that room saw a charming husband anymore. They saw a man unraveling. They saw exactly what I had been hiding for years. He looked around then as if realizing the weight of the scene he'd created. But there was no sympathy in the eyes around him. Only discomfort. And something like quiet recognition. Max didn't move. He didn't posture. He just stood, a stillness between chaos and me. Eventually, Derek gave a bitter laugh, muttered something under his breath and allowed the staff to guide him toward the door. He didn't look back. And I didn't feel shame. Not for the yelling. Not for the scene. Not for sitting there while the last thread of my marriage broke in front of a dozen strangers. I felt clean. I felt the tightness in my chest lift like a stone finally rolled away. The years of performance, of fear and self-doubt and exhaustion, they didn't vanish but they loosened their grip. And in their place came breath. Long, deep, full breath. Max sat down again, slowly, respectfully, as if nothing had been taken from me in that moment, only returned. I lifted my glass to my lips, took a small sip, and let the silence settle like a soft blanket over the table. And when I looked out across the room I didn't see pity or discomfort. I saw the truth. All of it laid bare. And I wasn't afraid of it anymore. I didn't wait until morning. The restaurant had already emptied by the time I stepped outside. The city was quiet in that way it only is late at night when the streets are dim and the air feels heavier, thicker with the weight of all the things unsaid between people. I walked slowly at first, not because I was stalling but because I was ready. I had rehearsed this moment 1,000 different ways in my mind over the years. Softly, angrily, desperately. But now when it was finally real I felt no need for theatrics. Just truth. The house was dark when I got back. He was sitting on the edge of the couch, elbows on his knees, head in his hands like someone who'd just realized the crash had already happened. The front door clicked shut behind me and he looked up, eyes bloodshot, not from alcohol but from unraveling. There was a silence between us, long and hard like stone, and I didn't try to fill it. I lost my temper, he said finally, his voice rough, low. But you blindsided me. What was I supposed to do? I didn't answer. He stood up slowly like he thought maybe there was still something left to fix. We can talk about this, he continued. Please, Suzanne. We've had bad fights before. We can go to therapy. I'll go. You can pick the counselor. I'll do anything. And maybe if he'd said those words 5 years earlier, 2 years earlier, even 6 months earlier, I might have felt something stir. I might have hoped. But now I heard it for what it was. Survival. Not love. Not remorse. Just fear. Fear of losing control. Fear of having no one left to validate the version of himself he had carefully constructed. He didn't want me back. He wanted the role I played. He wanted the silence I gave him. And I had nothing left to give. I'm filing for divorce, I said simply. The words didn't shake. I didn't flinch when I said them. He stared at me like I'd slapped him. You don't mean that. I said nothing. We've built a life, Suzanne, he continued, his voice rising. You're willing to throw it all away over, what? A dinner? A neighbor? One bad night? No, I replied, my tone flat, grounded. I'm leaving because I've already thrown away years of my life pretending this was something it wasn't. I'm leaving because I spent more time convincing myself I was happy than actually being happy. Because I spent years being treated like furniture in my own home. Something useful. Something placed. Never something cherished. His jaw clenched. You're overreacting. That word again. I almost laughed. He still couldn't see it. Even now, after everything, he was still trying to frame the story in a way that made him feel righteous and misunderstood. But I didn't need him to see it anymore. I wasn't standing there to convince him. I was standing there to release myself. I'm not coming back, I said calmly. This isn't a pause. This isn't a fight we'll forget. It's over. I watched the realization settle into his posture, into his breathing. He slumped back onto the couch and covered his face with both hands, like the room itself was spinning. I waited for the guilt to rise in me because it always had before. But it didn't come. There was no panic. No doubt. Just a stillness that wrapped around my ribs and allowed me to finally breathe fully without resistance. I didn't stay in the living room. I didn't sit down beside him. I walked past him into the bedroom and began packing a small overnight bag. Not because I was fleeing, but because I had already left. The part of me that stayed had already died a long time ago. I had just needed to walk far enough outside myself to finally see the grave. That night I slept in the guest room. Not because he told me to. Not because I was afraid. But because it felt like neutral ground and I didn't want the weight of memories pressing down on me. I lay on the unfamiliar mattress, my bag on the floor beside me, my phone face down on the nightstand, and for the first time in so long, my body felt quiet. No rehearsed answers. No held breath. No cold beneath my skin. Just rest. There were no tears. Not a single one. Not because I didn't care, because I had finally stopped bleeding. There was nothing left to grieve. Only space to begin again. I pulled the blanket over my shoulder and let the silence fill the room. And in that silence I slept. Deeply. Fully. As if I had finally returned to myself. The first morning in the new apartment, I woke to the sound of birds and the distant hum of lawnmowers. Not traffic. Not voices behind thin walls. Just quiet life unfolding outside my window. The sun poured through gauzy curtains I had chosen myself. Light gray, soft enough to let morning in without letting it overwhelm. The apartment wasn't big, but it was mine. 2 rooms, pale wooden floors, a kitchen with mismatched tiles, and a balcony just wide enough for a chair and 3 pots of herbs. Basil, mint, and thyme. I'd never grown anything before, not really. Derek used to say plants were just another chore, another thing to forget, but I didn't care if they thrived or died. I liked the ritual of watering them, touching the soil with my fingers each morning. I liked the way the mint left a trace of itself on my fingertips. The stillness in the mornings was new to me. I didn't rush anymore. I didn't wake with a sinking weight in my stomach or the sense that I was already behind. I made coffee slowly, barefoot, wrapped in an old robe I'd pulled from a storage box labeled college stuff. It still smelled like cedar. I sipped it on the balcony with my legs tucked beneath me, watching the street below, a little corner of Greenville I'd never even noticed before all this began. The town was smaller, quieter than Chicago, but it held me in a way the city never had. I didn't feel anonymous here. I felt present. I started running again. Not for time. Not for miles. Just to move. My legs remembered the rhythm quickly, and within a week I was weaving through trails before sunrise, letting the cold air slap the sleep from my face, my breath forming short clouds in front of me. No headphones. No noise. Just the sound of gravel under my feet and the steady thump of my heart. I didn't think about anything while I ran. That was the point. It was the only hour of the day where I didn't carry a story, a memory, or a list. I just existed. The ceramic studio sat above a bike repair shop, tucked behind a red-painted door with a brass handle worn from use. I signed up for classes on impulse. I had passed the flyer 3 times before I finally stopped and peeled the tab off the bottom. I don't know what I was expecting, somewhere between awkward and juvenile, but from the moment I sat at the wheel I felt something loosen in my chest. Clay didn't rush you. It forced you to be present. If your hands were too tense, it collapsed. If your mind wandered, the shape fell inward. Demanded care, attention, breath. I ruined 3 pieces in the first class alone. The 4th held. And when I pulled it off the wheel, lopsided and smudged, I smiled like it was a masterpiece. There was something deeply healing in getting my hands dirty. In watching my fingers disappear into cool earth. In building something from nothing. It reminded me that creation didn't have to be perfect. It only had to be mine. At work I finally said yes. The promotion had been waiting for me for months and I'd kept dancing around it, haunted by old echoes. His voice saying I didn't earn it, that I must have charmed someone, that I wasn't ready. But none of those voices were mine. And they didn't belong here. I stepped into the new role like I had always known I would. Director of Digital Strategy. My name printed clean and clear on a door that opened because I had pushed it. My team trusted me. My ideas moved things. My words mattered again. I didn't tell anyone right away. I wanted to hold it just for me for a while, like a secret I could taste before I shared it. I celebrated by buying a ceramic bowl from a local artisan and filling it with lemons. No metaphor. Just the brightness of them on my windowsill. Each morning now, I looked in the mirror and didn't see a woman trying to be small, polite, manageable. I saw cheekbones I'd stopped noticing. Eyes that weren't tired. Lips that curved, not out of obligation but out of quiet joy. My body had changed. Not from weight loss or makeup or some radical transformation but from release. I moved differently. I sat taller. I spoke slower. I took up space without apology. I didn't miss the old house. I didn't miss the quiet calculation of each word. I didn't miss waiting for praise that never came or wondering if I'd done too much, said too much, been too much. Now I was enough. Not in some abstract affirmation but in the way I breathed, slept, moved, lived. Sometimes I would catch my reflection in the glass of the bakery window on Main Street or in the rearview mirror while stopped at a red light, and I would pause, not out of vanity but recognition. That's me, I'd think. That's the woman I lost. And she's back now. She's not afraid to shine. He never tried to fix me. That was the first thing I noticed about Max after everything settled. He didn't arrive with answers or declarations. He didn't frame himself as the man who would save me from the mess I had crawled out of. He just showed up, in small ways, in real ways, and stayed. There were no sweeping gestures, no promises layered in expectation. Just presence. A quiet consistency I hadn't known I needed until I began to feel the weight of it gently holding me together. We met a few times after the night in the restaurant, but nothing about those moments felt like dates. They felt like breath. A coffee on a park bench. A walk through the farmer's market, where we mostly talked about tomatoes and bread and the color of other people's dogs. A shared laugh over a local bookstore's poorly alphabetized mystery section. He didn't flirt. He didn't press. He never reached for my hand unless I had already offered it. It was strange at first how easy it was to be near him. I had grown so used to tension, words carefully chosen, silence held like a shield, a low-level fear of being too much, that I kept waiting for something to snap. For his kindness to curve into expectation. For him to turn his patience into a ledger. But it never happened. He let me talk when I needed to. He let me be quiet when I didn't. He never asked about Derek unless I brought it up, and even then he never tried to define anything for me. He just listened, not with the intention to reply but to understand. His voice was always soft, never rushed. I remember one morning we sat outside the ceramic studio after class, sipping lukewarm coffee from paper cups, and he said, "You don't owe anyone a timeline." And something about the way he said it made my throat close. He didn't mean it as advice. He meant it as permission. And I didn't know I'd needed it until that moment. 3 months passed like that. Nothing defined. No title. No expectations. Just rhythm. Familiarity. A slow unfurling of trust that felt more solid than anything fast ever had. I was still healing, still catching myself holding tension in my shoulders when there was nothing to brace against. Still waking up from dreams I didn't remember but left me restless. Still working through the quiet guilt of freedom. But every time Max was near I felt something unclench. Not because he filled the space Derek had left but because he didn't try to. One evening I was coming home from work late. It had been a long day, meetings stacked back to back, deadlines shifting, a minor presentation hiccup that somehow left me rattled. The sky was already turning violet behind the buildings when I got to my front door, tired down to my bones, my feet aching from heels I regretted wearing. I opened the door and nearly bumped into him. He stood there with a grocery bag in one hand, the other gently adjusting the collar of his jacket like he'd been waiting a while but didn't mind. "I didn't know what you'd want," he said, "so I brought all of it." He handed me the bag, and inside were all the things I never remembered telling anyone were my favorites. Thai peanut noodles from the tiny place near the studio. A cold bottle of lemon kombucha. A small tub of that lavender honey yogurt I always pretended was too expensive to buy regularly. And a bag of dark chocolate-covered almonds. My comfort food. There was no invitation in his eyes. No expectation to be let in. He didn't ask to stay, didn't lean in to kiss me, didn't linger in the doorway with hope on his sleeve. He just offered the bag, smiled lightly and said, "I thought today might have been long." And that was when it hit me. Not like a spark, not like lightning, just a quiet, full-body knowing. It wasn't about romance. It wasn't about timing. It was about safety. With Max, I didn't feel watched. I didn't feel like I had to manage his feelings or translate mine into something softer. I didn't feel small. I felt seen. And more than that, I felt allowed. I let him come in. Not because he asked, but because I wanted to. We didn't light candles or turn on music. We ate from the containers, sitting cross-legged on the floor of my small living room, and talked about everything except the past. And when he laughed at something I said, I realized I wasn't performing. I wasn't adjusting myself to fit. I was just being. That night, as I washed our dishes and he dried them with an old kitchen towel, I looked at him in the soft kitchen light, his sleeves rolled up, eyes focused on nothing in particular, and I understood something simple and rare. This was not a man trying to rescue me. This was a man who showed up with food and quiet and time. Not as a hero. Not as a solution. Just as himself. And with him I could be myself too. I didn't search for news about him. I didn't ask. I didn't linger in places where his name might come up. But the story found me anyway. In a town like ours, especially among certain circles, stories don't need to be told twice. They travel in quiet glances, in the pause between sentences, in the sudden silence that falls when someone walks into the room. Derek had always been good at curating his image. He was polished, confident, sharp in meetings, always the one with the joke, the handshake, the right words at the right moment. But without me, the cracks became visible. At first it was subtle. People stopped laughing. That was the first shift. The same biting sarcasm he used for years, the smug comments wrapped in charm, the mocking tone he used to dismiss others when he felt challenged. Suddenly it wasn't funny anymore. People winced instead of chuckled. Eyes darted away instead of toward. His audience shrank and so did his power. I heard from a former colleague that Rivercrest Group asked him to take a leave, which was quickly followed by a quiet termination. No press release. No farewell email. Just a name removed from the company directory and the silence that followed. Word was clients had started pulling back. One high-profile account had reportedly requested to be reassigned after an uncomfortable exchange in a meeting. Something about tone, disrespect, maybe worse. The exact words didn't matter. What mattered was that the way he had spoken to people for years, the smirks, the undermining, the cheap shots, was no longer being dismissed as charm. It was being seen for what it always was. People started talking. Not in dramatic accusations or formal complaints, but in quiet, steady recollections. A comment he made at a Christmas party. A meeting where he mocked a junior associate's ideas. A pattern of making women in the room feel like they had to prove they belonged there. It was all small on its own. But together it formed something undeniable. He had built a career on confidence and likability, but the foundation had always been rot. And now, with no one left to hold it together for him, it collapsed. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't even feel vindicated. Just still. I heard that the house felt empty. That the rooms echoed. That he was seen drinking alone at the same bar where he used to hold court with his colleagues. That the friends who used to gather around his jokes slowly stopped answering his texts. That women avoided him at networking events, walking the long way around the room. And I knew why. Because once the illusion broke, once people saw what I had lived with behind closed doors, the mask didn't fit anymore. And Derek without the mask was a man no one recognized and fewer still respected. The last time I passed by that neighborhood I saw the house. The blinds were drawn, the yard slightly overgrown, a for maintenance notice stuck to the edge of the mailbox. The windows that once gleamed with curated light were smudged and dull. I didn't slow down. I didn't look twice. Because that house had never been a home. Not really. He was still there, I'd heard. Alone mostly. No steady job. A few consulting gigs that never lasted. The mortgage barely hanging on. No one came to his door with casseroles anymore. No invitations. No laughter spilling out from the patio. Just silence. And that was how his story told itself. Not with scandal. Not with spectacle. But with the quiet erosion of all the things he had built on my silence. Without someone to manage the damage. Without someone to absorb the blows behind closed doors. Without someone to smile when he mocked her, laugh when he belittled her, protect his image while hers cracked. He was just a man standing in a shell of a life he never truly appreciated. A man who mistook fear for respect, obedience for love, and clever cruelty for charm. And now, for the first time, everyone else saw what I had carried for years. I didn't need to explain. The truth had arrived all on its own. The scent of grilled vegetables and charcoal drifted through the air as I stood barefoot on the soft grass of my sister's backyard. The same backyard where everything had broken open exactly 1 year ago. The fairy lights were strung the same way, low and golden between the trees, catching in the leaves as the wind moved gently through them. There were new faces among the guests, laughter that didn't carry tension, and a calmness in me that I still wasn't used to, but welcomed like a second skin. Max was by the grill, sleeves rolled up, tongs in hand, focused on turning corn with the same quiet concentration he brought to everything. I watched him for a moment. No performance, no need to be the center of attention, just steady and present, always there without needing to announce himself. He looked up, caught my eye and smiled. That small, knowing smile that didn't ask anything from me, didn't try to own the moment, just shared it. And I smiled back, feeling it all settle into place without ceremony. It was the first time I had returned to this place since that night. The night everything cracked and the light finally got in. But I didn't feel dread. I didn't feel fear. I felt whole. Not triumphant, not dramatic, just whole. The air didn't carry the weight it used to. The ground didn't feel like it was going to slip out from under me. And I wasn't walking through it like a ghost anymore. I wasn't a shadow standing beside someone else's spotlight. I was standing in my own sun. I moved through the guests slowly at ease. My shoulders weren't tight. My words weren't measured. I laughed when something was funny. I didn't second-guess my expressions, my presence, my voice. My sister handed me a glass of wine and gave me that look, the one that said, "You're different," even if she didn't say it aloud. But we both knew. It was in the way I stood. It was in the way I looked people in the eye. It was in the way I didn't flinch when someone mentioned Derek in passing, not out of cruelty but in casual, forgettable context. Something about a client or an old office rumor. I didn't react. I didn't carry him anymore. That version of my life. The woman who molded herself to stay manageable, who apologized for taking up space, who dimmed her light for the comfort of someone who never truly saw her. That woman was gone. And not buried, not erased, but released. I had spent years surviving a life that looked good on paper but cost me everything real. I had learned how to speak quietly so he could feel louder. How to move gently so he didn't feel threatened. How to succeed without shining. But I wasn't doing that anymore. I had taken back my time, my voice, my joy. I had let myself be seen by someone who never asked me to be smaller. I had chosen a life that wasn't about escape or rebellion, but about return. A return to myself. And here, under the soft light of a new season, on the very ground where I once felt humiliation bloom across my chest like a bruise, I stood tall. I didn't need to prove anything. I didn't need to rehearse my story. It lived in me now, not as pain but as clarity. I looked down at the ring on my hand, not from anyone else, not a promise from a partner, but one I bought for myself a few months ago. A simple band of gold, worn on the middle finger of my right hand. A quiet symbol. Not of ownership. Not of status. But of a decision. A decision to say yes. To myself. Yes to being loud when I wanted to be. Yes to being silent when I needed to be. Yes to wanting more. To dreaming again. To living a life that felt like mine. Not perfect. Not scripted. But real. Honest. Free. Max called to me from the grill, asking if I wanted the first ear of corn, and I laughed, nodding as I walked over. He handed it to me wrapped in a napkin, warm and sweet with butter and spice, and when our fingers brushed, I didn't overthink it. I just felt it. The softness. The simplicity. The truth of being beside someone who met me exactly where I was. I looked around, watching my niece run barefoot across the lawn, the sun dipping low behind the house, the sound of someone starting a playlist in the background. I was no longer standing on the edge of anything. I had arrived. Not at the end of a story, not at a fairy tale ending, but at a life that belonged to me. And this time I wasn't afraid to shine.